Hi guys, my name is Tom and I'm the Tech Chap, and welcome to my Galaxy S7 review. Now you may have already seen my S7 Edge review video on my channel if you're a subscriber. If you're not, of course I recommend you do go and subscribe right now. But for this S7 review, I want to do something a little bit different. If you are a regular to my channel, you know I sort of do a face to camera and then a bit of B-roll and a bit of hands-on. But for this video, I want to just do a completely unscripted, completely just sort of ad-lib review of the S7 based on my experiences having used this since it came out as my primary phone. Now, it's been a few weeks since its launch, so the hype's died down a little bit, so I can give you what I think is going to be a very honest and very genuine opinion of the S7. So let's get started by talking about the design. As you guys know, this is very similar to the S6. There's only a few subtle differences. In fact, I do have an S6 for you guys here, so you can see the difference. There are some small differences we'll go into in a moment, but as you can see, they are pretty much the same phone. But the biggest difference for me is the curved back, which was first introduced on the Note 5, I believe, but it actually makes a big difference to how the phone feels in your hand. It's the curved on both sides, just on the back, obviously not on the front. This isn't the Edge model of the new S7, but that subtle curve helps the phone sit in your hand much more comfortably, much more securely than it did, I think, on the S6. Holding the S6 next to the S7, the S7 feels a lot more premium, actually, not as well as comfortable to hold than the S6. It's a very subtle change, but in my opinion, it makes a big difference to how it feels. And the fact that the S7 is actually slightly fatter and slightly heavier than the S6, if I put them next to each other, you can see the S7 is very, very slightly thicker than the S6. So I'm very impressed with the curved back of the phone. I think it makes a big difference to both the style and the feel of the phone. But something that hasn't changed is the metal band around the outside. Now, this is still quite premium looking. It's a metallic band, but it's still very susceptible to scratches and dents. It's something that I suffered from on the S6. I know I should use cases more, but if I bring the S6 over here, you guys can see, I'm not sure what's playing there, let's turn that off. You can see some scratches on the S6 here, and I found on the S7 Edge, which of course has the same metal band around the edge, although a little bit thinner, it suffers from the same issue that you can very, very easily scratch this metal. Now, the front and rear glass is Gorilla Glass 4, so that's very, very strong and very scratch resistant in my experience, but the metal band is very susceptible, as I say, to dings and scratches and things like that. Another thing to mention is the S7's camera, of course. It doesn't protrude as much as it did on the S6. Let's bring the S6 back one more time so you guys can see the difference in how much the camera protrudes. It's not an awful lot. If I get the light right, there you go. But it is obviously less so. But that could be more down to the fact that the S7 is in fact thicker and fatter, as I say, than the S6, which is obviously is covering up part of the lens. But the fact that it's still not flush, it is still proud of the device, means you still may want to case in order to protect that camera lens. But overall, not a great deal has changed in terms of the design, but I think that's a good thing. I think the S6 was a huge step up over the S5, and I'm still very impressed with how this onyx black model of the S7 looks. But obviously, one thing you can't see here is the fact that this is now waterproof, IP68 dust and water resistant up to, I think it's a depth of 1 meter for 30 minutes, which I think is very impressive considering there's no ugly flaps like you got on some of the earlier Sony phones. There doesn't appear to be any sort of noticeable difference that makes this waterproof. Obviously, it's all internal. There's little screens and rubber sealants, I believe, inside these ports, but it's very impressive that we can just dunk this in a bottle of water if we wanted to, or throw it in the river if you wanted to. I'm not sure why you would, but it's reassuring that this is actually a pretty durable phone given that IP68 rating, and yet, in my opinion at least, still looks really, really premium. As well as waterproofing, another great feature we're seeing a welcome return of is, of course, expandable storage in the form of MicroSD card support. The S7 comes with 32GB of built-in storage, but you can expand that by up to 200GB more with MicroSD, which is great to see because obviously the S6 dropped the feature first introduced on the S5. Now let's move on and talk about the display. We've got a 5.1-inch 2560 by 1440 display. That's the same size, same resolution as the S6, and of course smaller than the 5.5 inches on the S7 Edge. It's still absolutely beautiful. If I just flick through some of my pictures, let's try and find one that's not particularly embarrassing. It's absolutely beautiful to look at. The blacks are so deep and rich, and the colors are vibrant. It's genuinely one of the most impressive phones I've ever used, and in fact have been described by a few websites as technically the best smartphone display you can get at the moment in terms of color reproduction and gamma and contrast and those sort of technical things. But on a subjective level, just by looking at it, the colors pop. It's brighter. I think it's about 25% brighter than the S6. So as you can see, it goes all the way down and all the way up. I can't use enough adjectives to describe how fantastic this Super AMOLED display is. It really is one of the selling points of the Samsung phones. But what about performance? Obviously, that's one of the things we see upgraded in pretty much every new generation of phone. So in this model, this is the Exynos 8890 octa-core chip. Obviously, if you're in the States or in some other territories around the world, you will have the Snapdragon 820 version. There's quite a lot to read about that on the internet if you fancy looking at some benchmarks. Even if the 820 was, say, 10%, 20% faster in terms of graphics benchmarks, that's not something I don't think you're going to see in real life at all. So don't be put off if you're in the territory that will get the Exynos version. I think they're going to be just as good, and obviously Samsung are going to make sure to some extent that they are comparable because they are the same phone. People will be quite pissed off, I think, if one was significantly inferior to the other. So I wouldn't worry at all, but this obviously is the 8890 version because I'm in the UK, and which is in Europe, and that's the model that we get. As well as that, we also have 4 gigabytes of RAM. That's upgraded from 3 in the S6, so lots of tasty RAM for multitasking, because obviously TouchWiz is a bit of a system hog generally, and always has been. It's not too bad now, it's actually been improved further, but it's always good to get more RAM on these phones. Now, while the hardware is important, I think what makes a bigger difference to how everything feels from flipping between home screens and swiping and using the phone day to day is, of course, the software, which means TouchWiz and obviously Android. So as you guys can see, we're running Android 6.0.1, but what it does do, along with the new, more efficient hardware, is make the battery last a lot longer. I recorded this lasting nearly twice as long as my S6. You can go and check out my S6 versus S7 versus S7 Edge speed test on my channel right now. I do recommend it. It's quite a popular video because you can just see the huge difference between the phones. So this has a 3000 milliamp hour battery inside, which is quite a bit bigger than the 2550, which was in the S6. So that alone should give the S7 quite a lot of a better battery life, but it's also that combination of a more efficient Exynos chip, of Android 6, and presumably a more recent TouchWiz as well, that makes this last a lot longer. I would struggle to get to the end of the day on the S6. This one has no problem for the same sort of use, Spotify, web browsing, taking a few photos, maybe taking a few calls, sending some messages and checking social media. I would still have, say, 30% of my battery left at the end of the day compared to minus 10% probably on the S6. It's a huge upgrade. So if you guys are on the fence, if you guys already own an S6 and aren't really sure whether you can justify going to the S7, for the battery life alone, I do highly recommend it. It's a big step up. Now let's talk about the camera. It's one of the more controversial changes to this year's S7 because as I'm sure you guys know, the S7 has dropped to 12 megapixels from the 16 on the S6. But not only that, it's also changed to a 4:3 aspect ratio sensor from the 16:9 on the S6. So not only are we going down from 16 to 12 megapixels, if I open up the camera, I can show you guys. You can see here the maximum resolution is 12 megapixels. There we go. But if you, like me, prefer widescreen 16:9 shots, you see you're going to have to drop again even further to 9.1 megapixels. But despite the drop in resolution, if you go and check out my S6 versus S7 camera comparison, which is available on my channel right now, you'll see the S7 is still significantly better than the S6 in terms of camera. It's the new f1.7 aperture, it's the much larger pixels that make the S7 have much better low light photography and generally just more detailed photos because more light's coming in, it's capturing more detail, and even though the resolution is lower, the S7 is a significant upgrade over the S6 in terms of camera as well. In terms of video, there aren't any new frame rates or resolutions you can record at. There's still Full HD at 60 FPS, QHD and UHD. But one thing that has changed, previously on the S6 there'd be a little 5-minute time here because that would be the limit. It's restricted because of heat issues, but there is much better cooling, much better heat management in the new phone. So, and also obviously they're more powerful with the latest Exynos and Snapdragon chips. So that limit has been removed. But interestingly, on my S6 versus S7 camera comparison video, I also talk about this. And a few people have commented saying actually it's now only a 10-minute limit. Obviously it just doesn't show you. But that's not true in my case because I tested this the other day on the basis of these comments saying that actually it's limited to 10 minutes, which would still be quite a big issue. It adds 5 more minutes. That's not a big upgrade. But I had this running 11 minutes and then it went to 12 minutes and 13 minutes. I didn't have any restrictions at all. Now this is the Exynos version, and the people I believe who said that had this Snapdragon version in the US. So that would be pretty interesting to know. If any of you guys do have a Snapdragon 820 S7, do let me know if in the comments below if it's restricted to 10 minutes or not. That'd be interesting to know. But overall the camera is excellent and I think a decent upgrade over the S6. A quick word about speaker and call quality. If I open up a video just to get a bit of a sound going and turn it up. finally updated the iPad Air, and as we thought, it's not going to be called the iPad Air 3, but instead it'll be rebranded as it's the iPad Pro. Basically exactly the same as the S6. The speaker's in the same position, it's the same size. I don't hear any difference between them. They're both pretty solid in terms of quality. Obviously, we're not getting any stereo front speakers or anything like that, but for the S7, it's about the same as the S6 if you've ever used it. So I would say it's on par with the iPhones. It's not quite as good as those HTC Boom Sound phones, but on the whole, it's pretty good. Nothing really to write home about. It does its job, but obviously, most of the time, I would recommend using the 3.5mm jack on the bottom here. Now, speaking of ports, this is still a micro USB, the same as the previous phone. It's not a USB Type-C, unfortunately, which love it or hate it, is the future because it's reversible, quicker charging, faster data transfer. So that would have been slightly useful, but then again, all of your micro USB cables would have then been useless. But I still think my favorite feature of the phone is the display. It's just so vibrant, so pretty. You can, of course, change the screen mode, going between adaptive, cinema, photo, and basic. I kind of prefer on cinema myself, but that's obviously a personal preference. But it's just so vibrant, so vivid. It's absolutely beautiful to look at. And speaking of the display, I can't obviously miss always on display. I choose to have this off because some reports say that it drains about 10% of your battery over the course of a day when it's in standby mode. But you may think having it on and therefore not having to check the time as much will offset that battery loss. So that's obviously up to you. But the always on display, if I turn off, and there you are. You can have a combination of a time and day or a calendar, maybe even a picture. So it's obviously up to you. But one thing I do notice, and it's a little bit distracting as I have my phone to the side of me on my desk when I work, is that every minute or so the always on display sort of jumps around the screen a bit. That's to prevent screen burn-in, so there's a legitimate reason for it, but it's just a little bit distracting. And also that battery drain, I kind of want to get the absolute most out of the S7, so I turn that off. But that is something you can choose, so as I say, in the display settings, so it's completely up to you. I think the last question that a few of you guys may be wanting to know is, do I prefer the S7 or the S7 Edge? Having used both and reviewed both now, and in my opinion, I'm sticking with the S7 because as nice and as premium as the S7 Edge looks, I find the curved display just a little bit frustrating. Sometimes my palm gets into touches it and stops the keyboard from working. The reflections on the edge of the curve get a little bit distracting. It's also a little bit more expensive. For me, I'm going to stick with the S7 because it's just more comfortable to hold. It's more practical to use every day, and I think it's just as smart and actually more comfortable to hold. So that's my answer to the S7 versus S7 Edge question. So this has been my review of the S7. Thank you very much for watching. Do let me know what you think of it in the comments below. And of course, go and check out my S7 Edge review, as well as my comparisons between the S6, S7, and S7 Edge videos. There's loads of those on my channel, so I do recommend, of course, you go and subscribe. And also like this video if you did enjoy it. Thank you very much for putting up with my monotone voice, and hopefully I'll see you again right here on the Tech Chat.